Did you guys know that before the US Constitution that everybody knows of today, with all the different amendments that you can think of to it, there was actually another failed Constitution of the United States? Well, there actually is, and it's called the Articles of Confederation. It was actually written in 1777 during the American Revolutionary War as it was going on. It was very urgent because they were literally in a war and needed to come together to create a confederacy in order to fight off the Brits. Now, it wouldn't be ratified until 1781, and the American Revolutionary War would end in 1783. So what were the Articles of Confederation, and ultimately, why did it fail? Well, the Articles of Confederation was a constitution that was written that created this confederacy between the states. But what you have to keep in mind is that these colonies, these 13 colonies, did not want to have a strong central government, especially looking back at the fact that the British Crown was the reason why they were actually having this revolution in the first place. So the fact that, they were all about taxation, no taxation without representation, they're very skeptical of a strong central government in the first place. And they would more rather essentially ideally be their own little states. Rhode Island, Virginia, Maryland, all these states being their own states. But they have to come together to fight the Brits, the Redcoats. So naturally, you can expect that in this scenario, what's going to end up happening is the Articles of Confederation are going to be very anti-centralized government. And yes, that is exactly what happened. But in the Articles of Confederation, there was only a national Congress created. There was no national executive branch, and there was no national judicial branch, meaning there were no federal courts, there was no president of the United States. There was just one Congress that represented the national government, and each state had one vote. Now, Virginia was pissed because they had a pretty big population, more than multiple of the states combined, and they wanted to have actually representation based on population. Now, in the Congress, in order to pass anything, you needed to have 9 out of 13 states voting in favor. That's over 69% vote. Here in the United States, when we think about the Senate with 100 senators, 60 votes out of 100, which is 60%, is considered to be a supermajority. And the unthinkable number, which is 2/3, 67 votes, that's actually even higher than that margin that's required to actually convict the president and to get him out of office in the Senate. This naturally, of course, led to almost nothing getting done because of easily deadlocks from very small population states, like Rhode Island, for example, can come together with other small population states and simply block it. And so naturally, this led to obstruction and nothing happening. Now, when it came to amending the Constitution, you needed all 13 states to vote in favor to amend the Constitution. Now, this made it virtually impossible to be able to amend the Constitution because getting 100% of the states to agree was pretty much impossible. The National Congress didn't even have power to raise its own standing army, so it relied on the states to build up their own armies. However, it did have the power, the sole power to declare war, but it couldn't even raise its own standing army. They also didn't have the power to levy taxes, and so they relied on states to give them money based on their land values. And what happens if the states don't actually pay them any money? Literally nothing. So it was almost impossible to even enforce this, meaning that the states pretty much never actually paid the amount that they were supposed to, and if they did, it happened extremely in a very tardy manner. They also didn't control the entirety of the currency, and so while they did have control over currency, the states could also print their own currency too. So it was just a complete discombobulated mess. This National Congress also did not have the power to regulate interstate commerce, meaning that New York had certain regulations over commerce within its states, and Delaware would have different, and Maryland would have different, and this made it very difficult to be able to have a cohesive national economy. The government essentially was a complete failure because it really just had no way to actually enforce anything. Without a judiciary or an executive, the executive carries out the laws that are passed. There was no executive to do that, and there was no judiciary to both be able to make sure that their laws are actually being carried out by states, but also for people to protest against national laws. Here's a pretty interesting clause as it pertains to understanding some of the history of the Second Amendment and whether or not there was a right to constitutional right to own a firearm for personal defense purposes. Here's a clause that comes from the Articles of Confederation. It says, "A state cannot maintain any warships or other military forces, troops, during peacetime unless Congress has determined it necessary to defend that state, its trade, or forts in that state." Each state must maintain a, quote, well-regulated and disciplined militia and a sufficient amount of supplies for that militia. Based on that verbiage that we've seen, we can see that it's pretty clear that the roots of the Second Amendment aren't actually for personal defense, but rather for these militias that the founding fathers, as I've read in number 8, Federalist number 8 from Alexander Hamilton, he seemed to prefer these militias that were made up of civilians rather than standing armies, because he believed that these militias, as opposed to standing armies, actually led to more preservation of liberty and freedoms amongst the peoples. So it's pretty clear that there's no mention of personal ownership of firearms for self-defense here, but rather that the right of ownership for a firearm specifically has to do with being a part of a well-regulated militia, as states were the ones who had the power to have these armies to be able to fend off foreign and domestic invaders. So the Articles of Confederation were essentially in place throughout the American Revolutionary War. George Washington and his troops were starving to death because the states were refusing to actually give up any money in taxes, and so they were all starving to death. They didn't really care, obviously. Like I said, there was not much of a big fervor among a lot of the states for this unified government. And so now that we know what the Articles of Confederation are, well, why did they fail? Well, for all the reasons that I just mentioned, it proved to be completely, wholly ineffective. It was a hilariously bad knee-jerk reaction to the British Crown and their rule, and they just created a completely ridiculous government that gave the national government almost zero power. Again, it was only a Congress, didn't even have an executive or judicial branch, and that lack of centrality of power really led to a complete failure. And eventually, just 10 years later, after the writing of the Articles of Confederation in 1777 and 1787, the United States Constitution written, which would have much more powers for a central government. And there was no way that they were going to be able to maintain harmony and not fight with each other and also keep out foreign invaders without that U.S. Constitution. But the government under the Articles of Confederation completely collapsed, and there was so much chaos going on with all the different trade rules and all the different regulations and the different currencies and the fact that the national government couldn't create a military. It was a complete joke, and the government had become completely dysfunctional, and it was clear that a new one was needed. So it's important to read through this stuff and understand these kinds of things, why it is that, this extremely anti-centralized government system had actually failed, and why it is important to have that central power given nations' circumstances for survival.